Welcome to Talk Dizzy to Me, the show that brings you a comprehensive look into the complex field of dizziness. Now, here are your hosts, vestibular physical therapist Dr. Abby Ross and Dr. Danielle Tate.
Welcome to another episode of Talk Dizzy to Me. My name is Dr. Danielle Tolman, and I am, as always, joined by my co-host, Dr. Abby Ross, vestibular physical therapist and neuroclinical specialist. And today we have a very, very special guest that we are super excited about. We are joined by Cathy Epley, daughter of the famous John Epley in our vestibular world. So welcome, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. And congratulations on your getting married.
Thank you very much. Dr. Tolman. It has a nice ring to it.
I love it.
We are so excited to talk to you about your father because his contributions to the field are just astronomical. You cannot say the word vertigo without having the last name Epley being thrown into that conversation. So why don't you give us a little bit of a background on your dad? You know, I read a lot about him online in his some articles that were written about him, and he was a man of many different talents and interests, I will say.
Yeah. Did you see the article about him writing the fight song?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Yeah, I wrote that for the Klamath Falls newspaper. I thought that was a nice, nice introduction to my dad.
And that was for his school's football team, right? Which he was the quarterback of the football team, which is amazing.
Yes, and very handsome.
And then he also did a lot of work outdoors. He was helping with spotting forest fires and firefighting. And I mean, he was a man who he really put a lot out there and helped a lot of people all over the place.
Yeah, it seems like it was a family trait, I think, that the people in my family really were into contribution, and they had an approach to work where they just put their all into whatever job, be it counting sprockets to, being a doctor. So, yeah, everybody in the family is like that on my dad's side of the family.
That is absolutely amazing.
Yeah.
And with that, I mean, he left quite the legacy in the vestibular world and beyond. I mean, like Danny said, you can't say the word vertigo and not think of Dr. John Epley himself. One of the things that you had mentioned prior to the show was his ability to really listen to a patient. And that's what probably made him stand out as a clinician, but also helped get him to where he was in terms of figuring out the Epley maneuver as we know it today. Can you talk to us a little bit about him as a clinician, him in the vestibular world?
Well, he told me that he thought his real talent was being a diagnostician, and that part of that talent was that he listened to the patient. He didn't rely just on the objective testing, the V&Gs and the different tests. That was kind of a starting off point. And I think I learned some of that through osmosis. I found myself applying it when he had a stroke. I found myself in dealing with the doctors in the hospitals, seeing aspects of my dad that maybe the hospital would overlook. And there were several people who spoke at his memorial service who said that he was the most patient-centric doctor they had ever met. And then the people who worked for him all felt that way too. And I didn't really understand what that meant because it was just so much a part of him. I thought it was normal, a normal way to practice. But
it should be.
Yeah. I mean, it's too bad. I think that should be a bigger part of his legacy is the way you approach patients. And I know that he really helped change the way you approach the dizzy patient because so many patients were thought to be psychiatric cases or it was in the brain and they were kind of shoved aside. In fact, sometimes they still are.
You're right. I mean, that's something that we've actually spoken a lot about on our episodes, that listening to the patient should be your number one thing that you do. It should be the first thing during your evaluation is let the patient tell you exactly what's going on. Because if you listen long enough, they usually tell you exactly what is going on inside their bodies, and they're going to help you through that evaluation and being a better diagnostician. So that is absolutely the foundation of how both Abby and I practice today, and how many other people do practice and should practice, is they have to be patient-centered and focused. It's hard for people who experience vertigo because until you experience it, you really can't quite put your finger on how to accurately describe it. And even when it is happening to you, I mean, there's been so many different ways that people try to describe it that sound insane to other people, but it's not until you get to feel it yourself that you really understand, like, oh, yeah, it does feel like my brain is floating, or that the room is spinning, or that the earth is tilting. So being able to put patient focus first, I think, is probably what led him down this path of, really being an advocate for his patients and helping people out and making the impact that he did.
Yeah, in fact, I was at a party for a bunch of lawyers. It was an open house for a law firm, and there was the head of a medical malpractice. The doctors, not the defense, but the people. Well, I forget which side is which, but they represented the insurance companies, and he said that they had a handful of cases nonstop where my dad was the patient advocate. And he was sort of like a thorn in the side of the insurance companies who wanted to deny insurance, to cover the expenses, or cover the living expenses, or workers' comp, or whatever, because they were claiming the patient was malingering. And my dad was able to prove each time that they weren't. And he was there constantly supporting them. And this guy who was constantly going up as my dad was a thorn in his side for his clients, said he had a lot of respect for my dad because he clearly was a sincere patient advocate. So, yeah.
Also, that's so important in this patient population because for the most part, it's an invisible illness. It's not a broken arm that you see a person in a sling with. It's something that you really are relying on the patient's story. And while there can be psychological impacts from the vestibular symptoms, I still to this day have people come to me and say, my doctor thinks it's all in my head. And it's just heartbreaking because you want more Dr. Epleys out there that realize, that's not the case. While there can be psychological impact, these symptoms are real.
Yes, in fact, I was at an American Academy of Otolaryngology meeting, and I was in one of the classes, and there was a young ENT doctor, who's 40-ish, turned to me and said, "What do you do with all these patients who claim they're dizzy? They're all just, crazy." He didn't believe any of them. And he was an ENT doctor. So, and he was, and I was in a class, I think it was probably, a class on BPPV or something vestibular. Those are the only ones I went to. So,
yeah,
he thought I was a doctor. He assumed I was just another doctor. So, and I'm
it's not uncommon.
Yeah.
It's definitely not uncommon for people to hear that from I can't tell you how many patients say, "Oh, my doctor told me it was a normal part of aging to be dizzy, that this was something that was just going to happen. I had to live with it." It's still super common, which is why we as clinicians and people, we volunteer a lot with the Vestibular Disorders Association. We push to try to help raise awareness and get the training out there for the people that need that training. Making videos, having these podcast episodes, it's mostly to get the information out there and to get people on board. And I think they're seeing it more and more now, and it's being so much more accepted. But back in the day, this was a whole new thing. I mean, talk about being a thorn in the side. Your dad had to really fight through his new theory on what was causing this positional vertigo, and had a lot of pushback from everybody in the medical community.
Well, yes, it wasn't just benign positional vertigo. There were a lot of accident victims, post-concussive syndromes, and all kinds of things going on, where he was always testifying for patients and being the only one. And, and he was kind of the end of the line for people, and they would show up in his office and, they'd seen 10 doctors, their wife had left them, and their kids were no longer talking to them. They'd lost their job. They were bankrupt, and my dad was, if there was a way to solve it, he would try to solve it for them. So, yeah, and because of that, he never made a lot of money. He drove my mother nuts.
Funny. You know, the other piece that's so important, I think, is that the impact, one of the main impacts he had on the vestibular world is completely conservative. You know, it's not
Yes.
an invasive procedure. And while, you know, that may have implications in terms of finances on the physician standpoint, that's great for the patient. We love that conservative approach. Tell us a little bit more about how he dove more into BPPV and the particle theory.
So, you know, my dad was trained as a surgeon and was a very successful surgeon. He was, you know, in the top tier of you know, whatever the latest surgery was. If he hadn't been the first, he was the second or third to try it. And he was always right up there on the bleeding edge. And so he was very well known and respected as a surgeon. And he was one of the few that was doing, I call them vestibular nerve sections. I think doctors call them something else, but he thought it was a barbaric surgery. That's the term he used with me. And he said that there just had to be a better way, because that was the only way you could take care of benign positional vertigo back in the day. I guess that would be in maybe the 70s. And he was getting cases from all over the country because he was one of the few who could do the surgery, and he hated doing it. And so he just decided he was going to look for a better way. And he reviewed the literature and decided he had a physics background from college, had dabbled a lot in physics and was always interested in it. And he reviewed the literature and he decided that the prevailing theory didn't match with the physiology and the anatomy of the ear, that it didn't make any sense. And now I'm not a doctor, and it's been a few years since I've even, you know, thought about these terms, but I believe it was a mass. They thought it was a mass in the ear that was causing the vertigo. But he pointed out that if you turn the patient, the vertigo stops after a while, and that wouldn't necessarily be true with a mass. And so then he hypothesized that it must be particles.
Yeah, which is really cool. When you think about it, a lot of these breakthroughs in research have come from people that have paired the physics and the vestibular system. You look at Dr. Neil Shepard. Some of the new devices and technology that's coming out to mitigate vertigo are coming from people who primarily studied physics and physiology, and marrying the two is very interesting because it is an organ that's basically centered around movement, which is physics. So whether it's linear or angular, there's something there that is triggering the body to react the way it's triggering. So the fact that he came up with this theory that kind of upended everything that was originally thought was going on was absolutely amazing. And that was back around late 70s, early 80s, I think, right?
It was the late 70s, and he came up with this particle theory, and he submitted a paper a few times, and it was turned, and they turned it away. And then he came up with his maneuvers, and he described, the anatomy and the physiology and how you would turn a patient. So he described all the different ways you could turn it. Now they just, it seems to be the vernacular to refer to the posterior canal maneuver or the canal-physis posterior canal maneuver as the Epley maneuver. But he described all of them, and he just looked at the anatomy and the physiology and figured it all out.
That's amazing. What else I really love in speaking with you, especially, is that the word perseverance, it extends across the whole realm of vestibular care. So he not only had to persevere with patients, right, going through lawsuits and getting people better who have been to 15 doctors before him, but also he was changing the game and facing resistance, but made it out on the other side. I just think that's so respectable.
Yes, I have a lot of respect for him for that, and I think that's an Epley trait. Having watched it, I would never want to put myself out there like that, because I think it impacts your health and your and in fact it's his livelihood, and it's a tough road. He said the first time he presented it, or one of the first times, he said that a lot of people walked out and people were standing up and, or heckling him. And one guy made a big dramatic move. And these are all ear doctors or ear, nose, and throat doctors. And one guy came up, walked up to the front with my dad's hand out and threw it down on the table and said something about how this was complete bunk and walked out. And
wow.
Yeah.
Oh.
I bet those ENTs at that conference or wherever he was presenting would love to go back in time and redo that whole experience.
Oh, sure. Of course. Yes. And, there were, because he had a good reputation as a surgeon and he top schools and brilliant man, there were, especially his friends, so they listened to him. And there were plenty of people that listened and went home and tried his maneuvers. And over the course of, half a dozen years or so, pretty soon, there'd be 1,000 people in his course. It was the biggest attended course, I believe, in the history of the academy. And then he kept on submitting his paper, kept on submitting it. And then finally, there were enough people on the editorial board that had taken his class that he finally got his paper published in 1992. Well over a decade since he started talking about his particle theory and the maneuvers. So it took a while.
That's a long time. And after people have repeatedly gone back and repeated his study, his research, his methods, and had found success. I mean, when's enough at that point? You've got to hope that people start to get on board and see how much it's helping their patients. And I'm sure doctors were ecstatic to be able to help these patients, because what do you do with somebody that you don't know how to help? It's hard to just make that, turn around out the door and say, I can't help you. I'm sorry.
Yeah. And I think a lost in this too is the diagnosis. I'm sure the diagnosis can be pretty tricky. Just because the eye moved doesn't mean it's the posterior canal. Only about half of the cases are straightforward. The rest are a jumble of different canals and different variants, cupulolithiasis or apex block or multiple canals on two sides, canals on both sides. It can get pretty complicated.
It can. But when we go to these courses, and I do a lot of mentoring and teaching for different clinicians on this, is if you can apply the basic principles, if you can look at the physiology of the inner ear, you can take those tools and figure out what's going on. I'm probably sure similar to what your dad did. He looked at Ewald's laws. I'm sure he looked at how the anatomy was of the inner ear and was able to piece together this puzzle. It's what it is. It's a big puzzle, and you're right. It's very rare that somebody walks in with a very straightforward case. We technically start to see people that are more layered or complicated or atypical. And then everything doesn't normally go as planned during maneuvers either. You can have issues like canal lift jams, and you can have canal conversions, and you have to be able to think on your feet and picture what's going on to get the patient to feel better. And we at least have the tools to our disposal of the knowledge that your dad put out there in the field, because without that, I'm not sure I would have been as confident in being able to treat this. It can be very difficult.
Right. Yeah. So I think the diagnosis is important. And I know that, I worked with my dad for more than a decade with the Epley Omniac system. Mm-hmm. We commercialized that. And every time we'd sell a unit, even though the doctors were gung-ho to get it, who bought it, about 3 to 6 months later, I'd get a phone call every single time. And they'd say, I had all these patients that were under management, about a third of my patients, and they were just kind of sitting there, and I didn't know what to do with them. Maybe they had gotten a little bit better. Maybe it had backslid. Maybe I thought they had BPPV and I treated it and they got a little better, but not completely. He said, when we got the Omniacs, we cleared them all out. We were able to figure out that some of them didn't even have BPPV. They had something else going on, or we found it was in a different canal. And so it really helped clear all of that out.
Now, is the Omnimax still available for purchase? Is that something that's still on the market?
No, we during Obama, we launched right in the middle of the whole Obamacare recession thing, and it was just, and my dad had a stroke about 2 months after we launched, and it kind of took all the fun out of it for me. And And so we sold the patents to somebody who was not able to, who never did anything with them, at least not commercially.
Got it.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so I think we had about 28 out there. In fact, Fred Ehrig in Boston just retired, and he sold his unit to Glenn Zielinski here in Portland. And Glenn is, as I speak, I think the unit's being assembled here in Portland. So I'm glad that Portland has one. And so the units, as doctors retire, I hope they'll move around the country.
Sure. The other thing I want to point out too is when you think about time frame, that wasn't that long ago, right? It's crazy how much vestibular care has changed in the last 40 years, even. I mean, 30, 20 years. It's wild to me.
Yeah. My dad said when he was a resident at Stanford, nobody had ever seen BPPV before because they didn't know how to look for it. They didn't know what it was. And he said a couple times they'd have a patient on a table and somebody would come running down the hall saying, "We've got some BPPV," and everybody would go running the other way down the hall and try to catch it. By the time they got there, as the eyes had quit moving around. And so he said he went all the way through residency without ever seeing a case of benign positional vertigo.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, people just didn't know to look for it. They thought it was, they just thought it was psychological, or they thought it was in the brain. So it's a huge change. And I think my dad's very stubborn. It's a huge pro and con to his personality, but he just felt, once he figured out what he knew, he felt like he had to stand his ground and make sure that people would approach the dizzy patient much more carefully and look for benign positional vertigo and find there are cures, not just palliative solutions. I hate to use the word cure, but there are treatments, not just palliative solutions for the dizzy patient.
And thank goodness for that. I mean, millions of people is how many people he's helped. I can't tell you how many people come in, and I do a lot of patient education in the office, especially in the first visit. And I really want people to understand what's going on in their body and why this is happening to them. And I remind them that this is something that's fairly new, because they'll say something like, "Oh, my mom had this," or "My dad had this," or something in their family, but they never did anything for it. And I have to remind them it's only been in the last couple of decades that this has been figured out and applied and, is still being perfected. The maneuver that your dad came up with initially is very different from the maneuver and the precautions that we do today, just under the way that we, take precautions with the patient following maneuvers and things like that. But it's still essentially the same thing. And it's come a long way in a short amount of time. And a lot of patients, their minds are blown. They go, "I don't think I could have lived with this for the rest of my life. This is horrible. Who would not get treatment for this? This is crazy. This is insane." And they're grateful that something like this exists, and something so easy now where you can go on YouTube. We've put together a YouTube video where we go through and do a ton of education and explain how to do this maneuver at home and do it safely and when to do it and why you would apply it. But, please still go see a healthcare professional. And I think we've got hundreds and hundreds of comments on it just in the year of people saying how it saved their lives, how this got them back to being functional again. They wouldn't know what they would have done without it. And it's just something that is a staple in the vestibular community. This is not going anywhere anytime soon. It's concrete. It's here to stay. It's effective. It's, doesn't cost a ton of money. It's helpful for the patients. There's no drugs. There's no surgery. I mean, this is kind of like the gold standard when it comes to being able to give the patient something to be able to help them with an issue. It's really, truly amazing.
Yeah. And, I had a really bad case of it maybe 2.5 years ago.
Oh my goodness.
And I first had benign positional vertigo in 2002. I had a concussion, and that was one of the symptoms. But the really bad case I had was a couple years ago after I'd used a CPAP, and it apparently malfunctioned and went up to like the maximum level of air and went up into my eustachian tube, and it seemed to upset my otolith organ is damaged. And then and then I started having these really horrendous cases of positional vertigo. I was so sick. I was in bed by myself, and I thought if I didn't know what benign positional vertigo was, I would have thought I was going to die. It's very scary.
Yeah.
I tried to walk, and it was like I was in a dream, and so I sat on the edge of the bed, and I actually prayed to my dad, and I said, thank you. I said like a little prayer, a little thank you prayer to my dad, saying, thank you for creating this mover. And then I did it, and I couldn't believe it. It worked. It's one thing to have a mild case, and have it work. But this was a situation where I couldn't move my head left an inch or right an inch. I had to sit straight up in bed like this. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't do anything. And then I did the maneuver, and I was still a little groggy, but I was able to lay down and go to sleep. And I thought that was a miracle.
Yeah.
And I worked with them for years, and I still was shocked. Still shocked.
You said something that so many patients say, I thought I was dying. Like I had no idea. And what's so cool about the implications that your father has had on the vestibular world is that people really think we're magicians sometimes.
Mm-hmm. Well, it used to be called voodoo medicine. And I understand the MDs or the surgeons, they went to school to do surgery, and so they want surgical candidates. They don't want to fool around with dizzy patients because that's not their training. So it's been difficult for them. And I think that's a lot of the reason why the physical therapy community has taken up the vacuum and taken it on.
Yeah, we have a nice platform, right? So we have, because of reimbursement and insurance allowances and whatnot, we have the time to spend with the patient more than a physician would within their 5 or 10 minutes to be productive. Right. So we're in a unique position where we've got 45 minutes to an hour to spend with the patient multiple times a week over multiple weeks, where they can follow up with us and we can assess each time they come in and treat along those lines. And there's a very big tie-in to balance and function and other conditions, right? Because it's very rare that we just have one issue. There's multiple layers. We can approach the patient holistically and look at their balance and their gait and their function, being able to move their head, and bring in more aspects of vestibular therapy. So we are very fortunate to be in a unique position to help this patient population, right, to afford us to do that. 100%.
Right. No, I think it's great that, because my dad was a little skeptical. Being a doctor, he preferred that doctors look at it. He also emphasizes that a doctor still needs to diagnose and has the VNG and the different kinds of equipment that can help. And after I did the maneuver, it was an emergency situation for me. But the next day I called and got in, to see somebody and have them do it. Because mine's, I started having problems clear back in 2002 after a rollerblading accident. Oh. I went to my doctor. I started having weird symptoms, and I went to my doctor, and she said, "Oh, you're just anxious because you started a company with your dad, and you're under stress, and that's why my symptoms were, I couldn't go to the grocery store. If I just go to Costco, and I'd have to lie down in the car, but I could go run 5 miles, but then I'd go to the computer and try to get some work done. And I thought I was not able to work because I just get so sick every time I sat down at the computer. And so she put me on Paxil, and then I gained 5 pounds. And then I was depressed on top of anxiety because I'm getting fat. And so then I was too embarrassed to tell my dad because I thought I was cracking up. And all I had done at that point was we had written a grant together. I really, before I started working on this project with my dad, I didn't even know the names of the canals. So it was all, And so I finally admitted to him that I was, that I had a problem because then I had a BPPV attack, and I recognized right away what that was. So I went to him and I told him my other symptoms, and he said that I had a post-concussive syndrome, and he gave me corticosteroids in the ear. He gave me 3 shots of corticosteroids over 3 months, and it didn't come back until 2008. So that's 6 years without any problem. And I windsurfed and skied, And then in 2008, it came back in a milder. It was milder. So
that's amazing. That must have been a very funny wake-up call to kind of go through that after, your dad spent his entire career treating and researching and studying and then going into, this business with him. It must have been very odd to then have to go, oh, wait a minute. Now this is kind of hitting close to home.
Yeah, no, at least that was the one thing I understood when we first started out was benign positional vertigo. So, and I had worked in the cardiology field, and I felt that the reason why his theories took so long to be accepted was because there was no money behind it, no incentive for doctors or any medical profession really to take it on, because to become expert, it takes time. And if you can't make ends meet, or you're making $30 or $50 on a patient that takes 20 minutes or a half hour, it's hard to even make the overhead. And so the Epley Omniac system was technology where you could have an objective test, and you could do a lot of diagnostics, not just for benign positional vertigo. It did a lot more. And so I felt that, it would drive acceptance. It took us a long time, to have it, to get it to come to market. But, in the medical field, it is very hard to get acceptance for something like a maneuver that is very cost effective. But the medical professionals need to make money too.
Trying to sell a vestibular program to a clinic director or your employer and let them know, hey, I can fix somebody in 1 or 2 visits. They go, but we need to see them for like 12. What do you mean you're going to discharge them in 2 visits? That's not good. What are we doing here?
That's right. And I'm the person who was selling into I sold to physical therapists, MD, and different, neurologists, ear doctors. And every single time I was competing with, with the ear doctors, is competing with the hearing aid room. And hearing aids do quite well because they're cash. And so they're saying, are we going to get a hearing aid fitting room, or are we going to get an Epley Omniacs? So
it's tough.
It's tough.
Yeah.
It's tough for the doctor who sees dizzy patients. It's a labor of love.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're absolutely right when it comes to that. It's definitely more the philanthropic person who really is kind of pulled into this, because you're right. It's not a huge money-making business, but it is a aspect of our healthcare system that is very underutilized because many people don't specialize in it, but it is very, very much needed based on the prevalence of patients that have vestibular dysfunction. So there's definitely that little bit of an offset, but it's the people it's the Epleys of the world that drive us and keep us going.
Yes, just so we're clear, I did not inherit my dad's genius. Unfortunately, I didn't.
I wouldn't sell yourself short, Cathy.
Well, I've always been in awe of my father. So,
well, you and many, many other clinicians. I mean, is there anything you'd like to direct our listeners to? Any information about your dad or his work, or anything that has been currently going on that we should make our listeners aware of?
Well. No, I think we did a pretty good job. I think what I wanted to say about my dad was, I think that somebody who changes the way that you approach medicine, there's a lot that goes into that. They don't just one day wake up and have an idea. It takes years of research. It takes years of sacrifice. And my poor, long-suffering mother, my dad was under a huge amount of stress. I think people need to understand what it takes to get a medical advance accepted. It takes a generation. So, again, and sometimes if there's medical technology behind it, it can happen a little bit faster, but it takes a generation to see, a major medical change and have it accepted.
No, you're right.
Yeah. And just,
I never thought about that. I mean, I know there's resistance, but the sacrifices that your father made to make such a huge impact on our medical field is incredible. And I thank you so much. We thank you so much for your insight and your stories that you shared about yourself and your experiences with vestibular symptoms too, because you are so relatable to so many of our, not only listeners, but patients.
Thank you. And
All
I think your podcast is great.
Thank you.
Thank you for doing it. I really appreciate that this resource is out there.
Yeah, we're just hoping to put as much out there as we can. So we'll be sure. I want to link in the show notes to your episode some of the information we found on your dad, some information they can find about Epley maneuver and his career. And we just, again, thank you so much for coming on and talking with us. This was really, really special and near and dear to our hearts.
My privilege. Thank you.
Thank you. Good night, everyone.
If you're interested in finding us on social media or the web, you can visit www.vestibular.today for more resources, including testing, treatment, and educational videos, blogs, continuing education classes, and resources including clinic equipment recommendations, suggested tests, and BPPV treatment charts.
Search Vestibular Today and Balancing Act Rehab on all social media platforms, including Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. Also, be sure to check out Balancing Act Rehab at www.balancingactrehab.com, especially if you think you would benefit from vestibular therapy. We are your girls. The information on this podcast is not intended to replace the care provided by your qualified health professional or to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always seek the advice of your physician or other qualified health provider with any questions you may have regarding a medical condition. Never disregard professional medical advice or delay in seeking it because of something you have heard on Talk Dizzy to Me. Please contact us at Balancing Act Rehab if you think you could benefit from vestibular therapy.